Well, greetings and welcome to what I am billing as another installment in my Tough Minds, Tender Hearts and Steady Hands playlist of podcasts, which I started 3 years ago when the coronavirus took hold of us. Just to explain, it comes from a sermon of Martin Luther King Jr. that impacted me when I was an undergraduate student, and he was reflecting on a text from the Gospels where Jesus says, "Be ye therefore wise as serpents and gentle as doves." The sermon addresses the assumed dichotomy of post-enlightenment modernity between faith and science. The gist of his sermon was to explain that there is no conflict between faith and science, only between tender-minded believers of faith and tough-hearted scientists. And ever since reading that sermon, I've always been on the lookout for people who embody that combination, to be mentors, tough, rigorous minds, tender, compassionate, loving hearts. But looking for them now among people who are older than me is becoming more difficult because they're all dying. In fact, both of my mentors, Manfred Max Neef and Professor Stafford Beer, have died. But I'm now thrilled to discover that there are younger tough minds and tender hearts who exemplify those qualities, like Dr. Alex Gomez-Marin, who's already acquired citizenship in 2 disciplines, theoretical physics and neurobiology, and he's only 42. And in fact, today's his birthday, so I feel very privileged to have that opportunity to reflect on how I can play my role in some ways as a mentor to younger people with questions that younger people have been grappling with, so that maybe I can reimagine my own experience in a way that's helpful to them. Now, Alex has, among other things, co-authored an academic paper titled Reproducibility and Replicability of Rodent Phenotyping and Preclinical Studies. Now, maybe he would like to tell us a bit about rats, but it's his time, it's his birthday. I wanted to give this to you, Alex, as a gift. But before we get into the cognitive intellectual stuff, Umberto Maturana, whom I suspect was one of Alex's mentors, said, "Everything that is said by someone." So who's the person that's going to say some things today to educate us, starting with, Alex, your grandparents? Which of them had the greatest influence on you, and what have you inherited from them? What legacy have they left you that you feel abides?
Yes, an unexpected one. Because it's not only that people don't ask those questions, it's that I don't tend to think about them that often. So that's interesting you're asking this to begin with. Well, one of my grandfathers I didn't meet, or I met for a month. He died 1 month after I was born, so I don't have memories of him. But he came from a family that used to work in the mines, and actually I think my grandfather's brother, when he was 6, he was already working in the mine. So it's a reminder of how difficult lives are and used to be. And nevertheless, well, I would like to imagine that they were happy as kids. So it's even stranger to try to conceive how were they when they were young, you see. The other grandparent of mine, yes, I met him for many years. He passed away already, and my grandmother, one of them, already passed away too. And there's one living grandma I have, and she has beautiful blue eyes and she sings. She's losing a little bit her mind now, but one of the things that brings me more joy is that I was able to introduce her to my 2 daughters. So seeing that bridge across generations is pretty special, and how my daughters talk about her and ask me, it's like, well, that's your grandmother, and she sings so well, and she's so delicate. So I don't know if my daughters will remember her. Probably they will. That's as far as one can comprehensively cover, at least while being in the flesh. I'm not sure I want to share more about my grandparents and grandmothers, but I appreciate you started with the question of ancestors and where they are now and what they mean to us. Do we ever really remember them? Do they remember us? Because that ties, that brings the past very close to the now, at the same time that, as you know, I like to think about the future and also bring it to the now in these conversations I'm having on the future scientist and the future human and so on. In a way, you were also alluding to that when asking about younger people. Well, yes, I'm 42 today. Back to the Monty Python, perhaps I'll get a little glimpse of the secret of life, the universe, and everything today. but I consider myself not so young anymore. Of course, I'm young, but not so young. And like you, I'm also wondering, where are those young minds, young hearts, and young hands? Where are they now? What do they want? What do they need? I'm really trying to find them. There's a gap. Talking about generations, there's a gap. My older daughter is 7. My younger friend, maybe is 33, let's say. So from 7 to 33, I have no idea what's going on in the world. And I'm not going to trust it on social media or legacy media news. I don't know what the really young minds, I don't know where they are. Again, it's not just that I want to know what do they, not just what do they need, what do they want? Well,
Well, I mean, just to say, Alex, they find me, and this is why I thought it was so useful in my role as a social worker, as a counselor, trying to offer mentorship to younger people, to encourage them, hopefully to save them the suffering and making the mistakes I've made, and whatever I learned from them, so I can hand them on. And so in that sense, why I'm looking to you is that you can help me know how to respond to them coming 20 years younger than me or so. One of the quotes which came my way in preparing for this was Max Planck's quote, where he says, "A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it." So you see where I'm seeing this as perhaps a key for me to say, on one hand, I have to inspire young people. I don't have to. I want to. I don't want to leave them dreadfully depressed, and I want them to have a sense that life is worth living, that there is mystery and creativity and potential still within this evolving cosmos. So that's really, in a sense, where I'm coming from. Thoughts about that?
well, yes, and I can see why you frame your conversations as mind, heart, and hands, because I'm more used to talking from the head. But the things you're asking or you're reflecting on straight away are moving my heart right now, and also have to do with my hands in the sense of what I do every day, because it's even, in a way, it's even slower than one funeral at a time, as the famous quote. That quote is meant to be for scientific paradigms and ideas. Well, my experience in academia is that, well, if only it was one funeral at a time. It is not, because of the whole education or indoctrination or even cultural system, right? Because you get, as a young mind, you're carved for many years in what I call, it's not only the yoga of objectivity, which makes sense. It's you very quickly learn, like kids do, the rules and roles of the system. And like kids, and I think Piaget studied that deeply, Maybe you're not even aware, maybe you cannot make explicit what the rules are, but they already permeated your body. So I see it in young minds, in young students, and in undergrads and PhD students. Very quickly and quicker, they get what the game is about. And that innocence, that curiosity starts to be compressed by other matters, have to do more with career building, and even the selection pressures that one intuits as an organism, that one needs to comply with in order to be in the game, in order to survive, right? I don't want to make this too negative. I think it's just a statement of a fact. And so those young minds will behave like their parents and grandparents, as we were talking about before. And so the change it's even slower. And that fits back, I would say, into my experience as a father that I hardly talk about. But of course, we want to be good fathers and good mothers. And that was this thing I used to hear. Well, your dad or your mom, they did as best as they could. And there's even this notion of a good enough mother, which I think is very interesting. We can touch upon it. But what I want to say is that even trying hard to be a good father, if I'm honest about it, I realize that in my own efforts to do good, I'm constantly pouring these habits that I've inherited and I've made mine, but they don't belong to me. But they're so hard to tell from a truer sense of spontaneity that I wonder, like in these efforts to mentor, educate, perhaps we should just leave more rooms, stay out of the way, because in trying to help, this is like the planet, right? In trying to help, there's some people that really are really helpful and unhelpful at the same time, because they're trying to help so much that it becomes unhelpful. It's like, well, perhaps what we need is space and let things happen. And actually that's as I understand, that's the root, the secret, the etymology inside the word education is just like a garden or a forest. Let things come out, not stuff information or thing into a thing, but let it just express itself as it is. So it's a paradox. It's a paradox I face in my professional life, and it's a paradox I face in my personal life.
Yeah. Now, before we get into the cognitive head stuff, just to stay a little bit with the heart, I'm aware that in your context, you've just hosted Stephen Jenkinson, he's still one of the mentors or intellectual mentors that has helped me, precisely because he's also a social worker and he's also studied theology. And when my father-in-law was dying, I was reading his book, Die Wise, and just helping me understand, what this whole death trade is, and the fact that how our technology is all so preoccupied in our modernist society on a false assumption that we're going to live forever. But he's now moved on to looking at the necessity for our connection with your ancestry. So I'm just curious to know, how was that encounter and that experience with him? Were you able to interact with him, and what thoughts have you got that you can pass on to me?
I came across Die Wise maybe a year ago, a bit more, by chance, or I forgot what brought it to my life. You may not know, maybe you do. I had a near-death experience 2 years ago. So that was also in the context of why I was interested, and it was more that interest in those matters. We can talk about this later if you want. So I come across Die Wise. I listened to the man. I listened to Stephen Jenkinson online. I'm intrigued and a bit bewildered, not just by what he's saying, but how he says so. His use of English, he's using a different grammar. His grammar of thought is alien to me. And so it's like, what is this man saying, and what is he trying to say, and why does it sound like this is not English? So I become very interested. I had a chance to have a few Zoom conversation with him privately, and then I invited him to be in conversation with me in the Future Scientist series. Perhaps he didn't belong to the Future Scientist, but who cares? I just wanted to talk to him. And recently, I'm covering this so that our listeners know a bit the trajectory. And from that conversation, we both felt that, well, we wanted to have more, I suppose, and we invited him to Pari, this village in Tuscany, Italy. There's the Pari Center there that I direct, and we invited him to come, spend a month, write part of his book, his new book, and culminated with a 4-day workshop event on Neverland. Okay, how was that experience? That was actually 2 weeks ago. I think, in a word, what he did was an exercise. That's as much as I could compress. Not an exercise, an exorcise.
Exorcist, as in
yes.
getting rid of the demons.
well, getting rid of them or acknowledging them and then employing them, keeping them busy so that we can see what's going on beneath the surface, deep down in the ground. Maybe that's also related to Neverland. I want there to try to summarize because it took him literally 4 days in a rush to unpack what he's trying to tell us. And that's why he's writing a book and so on. But yes, it was about ancestors. It was about what happened to us as humans when we started to divide the world into what we call sacred, and what that does to the world. Because the moment you call something sacred, it entails that something it is not. So you see, maybe I can tie this back to my previous comment. In trying to help, in trying to heal, this is like the maxim of medicine, isn't it? Like the Hippocratic Oath, like do no harm. Well, in trying to help, maybe we're screwing things up. So in calling things sacred, we're implicitly conveying to everyone in our culture that there are things that are not sacred. And so that creates a really complicated business in our minds and in our hearts. And it's really hard to exorcise it, to see it and find a way to just put the demons in the right place. So that's how I would summarize what happened. But it's not possible to summarize. I think one of the in the age of Twitter and few characters and headlines and clickbait, we don't have patience for a man or a woman telling us for 4 days, and just really it felt and it was like not just an unpacking. Stephen used this metaphor. He said, look, Alex, what I'm doing here is I'm building a mountain, I'm climbing it, and then I'm trying to tell you how you may want to climb it too in a spiral. So you see, that needs time and presence.
Yeah, not just taking the shortest route to the top. And I love that. In fact, I really hope I can have a similar conversation with Stephen in the near future, because we can explore that theme too. And just to relate it back to the question of ancestry, just to put a context to where I'm coming from for your people who follow you, is that living as a South African, being initially very self-conscious about the fact that I was a colonialist, for the last 20 or so years, I have had to experience what another friend of mine, another mentor, Alistair McIntosh, talks about, an indigenization, about coming home to earth, to connect with this context and to transcend, or to get out of that paradigm that, which I think is part of the modernist paradigm of, where we think that the human species arrived from another planet, arrived on Earth, and was going to mine its minerals, get what it needed out of it, and off it would go and find another planet, hopefully in close commuting distance, and this planet will be trashed. And there's a whole shift of consciousness saying, hang on, we do not live on the Earth as if it's a in terms of what they call a cadastral area of just two dimensions. We live in the earth, its ecosystems. We are evolved from the earth. And I come as from Catholic background, which originally, this was like complete heresy until Taylor de Chardin came along as a paleontologist and a priest, and he said, there is no contradiction between evolutionary theory and faith. And suddenly there's this whole new mindset. We are from dust and we will return to dust. So my concern is we go back into the earth and the earth's systems and cycles carry on. So that's my context. And that's why I just offer that to you as a thought, because I just love what the Parry Center is doing. I was so warmed to it. Just in terms of the way you framed it, particularly since you said you don't have a mission statement. And let me say why I like that is because I'm sort of an evangelical Catholic Christian going out there to try and convert the world and fix it on missions. Then I worked for the World Health Organization for 3 years. In the United Nations system, you're on a mission all the time. And you're on a mission to here, there, and everywhere. And we're looking at humanitarian crises in Africa and what can be done about them, HIV, AIDS, drought, and governance problem. And at the end of it, I was rather sort of like disillusioned and burnt out. And then somebody said, well, maybe our place in this world is not to go on a mission, to be in pilgrimage, in constant pilgrimage towards deeper consciousness. And that's why I love Stephen's idea about circling up this mountain. I'm now more interested in circling down the mountain as well, into the valleys. Sometimes the valleys are the places of the richest learning, the richest insights. It's where we kind of have to confront the shadows and all those fearful things. And I hope that I can offer to people something that says, well, yes, it worked for John. We know him. Well, no reason why it can't work for me too. Nothing particularly exceptional about him. God loves all people equally. So tell us a bit more about Parry.
Well, that spurs many thoughts in me, because I never made this connection between having no mission statement and the question of monotheism. So maybe you want to hear, but this thought just occurred to me because of our culture, and of course we live in different continents, and our listeners probably do, so maybe they have a different view of the world, but we've inherited the operating system. It's like Windows. It's hard to get rid of them. Our Windows operating system, it doesn't matter if it's 95, XP or whatever, in a way is monotheism. And I'm very respectful to Christianity in particular, and very puzzled by the idea of the Trinity. I mean, I think this is deep. But what about adding a little letter after the word God and say gods? I've learned this also from Stephen, right? If we think in terms of gods rather than God, a God, then all this talk for interdisciplinary pluralism, art sciences, and the sacred becomes more real. There's more skin in the game, because now there's no one mission. If they're gods, then we should adopt a stance that allows us to explore and not in a nihilistic way, but never really commit to a view, never be obsessed with certainty, which is, by the way, what we learn also from modern physics and so on. And so I think that's perhaps one of the reasons why it's interesting not to have a mission statement, because the people that come to Parry, well, we talk about things with this spirit of inquiry, right? We're trying to find things out, and we want to listen to really other ways of looking at the world and not collapse the response into, okay, that seems to be the way. And that doesn't mean we're relativists or that I believe that truth is whatever we make of it. It's complicated. Truth, like McGilchrist says, is more like an encounter with the world. So it's this participation. Well, I'm rambling, but the connection between no mission statement, and monotheism, perhaps it's worth exploring.
Your point about the Trinity, that's something for me which expresses this unity and diversity and a sense of a relational understanding of truth that's not sort of dogmatically set in stone. And, that sort of like prescriptive type of, morality, which of course just my children, young people, they just switched off by that. At the same time, there is a sense in which I see people are yearning for a sense of deeper meaning and purpose. And let's now talk about how I got to really discover you.
Well, Alex and I are about to talk about a book that I wrote over about the last 10 years called The Matter with Things, subtitled Our Brains, Our Delusions and the Unmaking of the World. I was very fortunate that Alex approached me to talk some more about this, and we don't know how many sessions we will do, but we thought we'd start at any rate at the beginning of the book and discuss that and see where we go. Alex is a remarkable person. I'm personally in awe of his curriculum vitae. He is a theoretical physicist by training and has a couple of doctorates in physics, but he then retrained as a biologist and has worked on molecular biology and empirical zoology, but also on theoretical aspects of biology, and is currently a professor at the Institute of Neurosciences in Alicante. So he's a person with a remarkable breadth of interest and mind. This is very nice for me because I find that I don't easily fit into any particular box. I'm generally interested in philosophy and have been since my younger years. I started out training in literature and the humanities, and then read medicine and became a psychiatrist with particular interest in the overlapping areas of psychiatry and neurology. We need to see what happens, and I'm rather excited about it.
Well, thank you, Iain. It's a pleasure, really, and an honor to take part in this journey with you and to continue learning from you and with you as we cover your really, really remarkable book. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Maybe just to preface it by this, one of my other mentors, Luc Huiker, Belgian, said to me, if you're going to be a systems thinker and really be true to systemic thinking and the complexity of it all, you've just got to be very humble because we ultimately not in control. There are so many contingencies, and that there is no way in which you just find the right lever to pull and you're going to get what you necessarily want on the outside. It presupposes a totally different conception of power. I mean, one of my mentors, Stafford Beer, but he always talked about the universities as being the hardening of the faculties, where there's this fragmentation of knowledge, the setting up these boundaries then became barriers, and then of course the human egos getting involved and all the rest. I'm just sensing in Iain and in you, people that have said, that's not the only game in town for our exploration and seeking to understand the world better. How can we do things differently?
Well, Iain is an extraordinary man. And you may have read him or listened to him. I've also got to know him because we've spent many hours on Zoom and live, but also offline. What a contrast between what a person can know and the humility and this attitude of not knowing. It sounds, and it is, like a coincidence of opposites, and it also sounds a bit cliche, like the wise man who knows so much and seems to pretend they don't know. But I've been blessed by this interaction with Iain, and it's been an adventure, and we took risks in a way, and we didn't know. We started recording one by one the 28 plus 1 chapters of his 2-tome volume, and it was an experiment. We tried out, and it worked better, and so again, it's amazing to see how new initiatives can grow, and what that did to my thinking, but also my feeling. And now I consider him a friend, and he considers myself a friend as well. This has been beautiful, and I think it comes from a position of innocence. I think I mentioned this a few minutes ago. Because, you know, sometimes I must admit, let me make a confession here. Sometimes I feel like an imposter, like there's something in me here, like maybe a Gollum and a Schmeagol. Yes, and one of them says, you don't know what you're talking about. You're flying all over the place. You should stick to your expertise. You know, you should carve your own niche, your own name. Like, look what you did, Alex. I mean, I have these voices in my head. You used to be a theoretical physicist, finding off. You moved to neurobiology and you studied these little creatures for some years. Well, but now you, as you mentioned, right, from insects, I studied rodents, but now you're studying humans, and now you're studying not just cognition and behavior, but consciousness, and now you're interested in the edges of consciousness, and now you're talking to these psychiatrists, and now you're like, what are you doing, Alex? I mean, just shut up, you don't know. And that's one part. But the other says, precisely, that's why I'm doing it. And it's not out of mere curiosity. It's a sense of awe, a sense of reverence, a sense of adventure. And there's something quite feminine. I want to stress that out. And I know this can lead you into trouble, men, women, you know, male, female, but I think it's a feminine aspect in me that allows to receive, to be receptive, to, rather than, because you were talking about power, it's not a power that does things, that executes things. It's more a power that invites, hosts, receives things, be it people, ideas, happenings. And this is the kind of power that I've been tuning more and more recently. And it's it's quite powerful, it's deep, but you're not in control. That's the exchange. You're not really in control. That thing, whatever that thing is in control. That demon, that good demon is in control. And the more you let them come, the more they manifest. I know that sounds esoteric, and it is.
Well, I mean, that it's that coincidence of opposites. I mean, just to move on from this point, that quote that I quoted from Matthew, as wise as serpents and gentle as doves, it comes from a previous coincidence of opposites. I'm sending you like lambs among wolves, two created creatures who we respond to as seeming to be as in opposite terms, but yet we've been invited to basically ride out this paradox into what the mystery of what it means for us. And it can't be, in a sense, whether there are one gods, two gods, many gods, and that the end of the day is, to what extent does the divine in me be actualized? And as I'm getting a bit older, I'm just amazed to see the serendipitous connections that seem to happen out of the blue, you know, and I just take time in contemplation, reflection, and just let go. And my gosh, suddenly all sorts of interesting, the popcorn starts to pop, as it were. And the next thing, the lid's blowing off because there's so much popcorn that suddenly multiplied out of this situation. But let's indulge our heads a bit. The dual hemisphere hypothesis of the brain. That was what Ian took that as a sort of a notional idea that was floating around in pop psychology. And then as a doctor, neuropsychiatrist, then grappled with it and wrote a book called The Master and its Emissary, which then started to kind of, quoting the thing about Max Planck, initially looked at with skepticism from the scientific community, but now those people are perhaps dying off. And now he comes and he writes a subsequent book, has spent him 10 years to do, to basically not just deal with the philosophical and scientific objections to it, but to take the risk exactly that you and I are now feeling our way into, because we're supposed to have this separation between faith and science. In your personal faith, that's your personal domain. Science is in the public domain. Never the twain shall meet. Keep them private and personal. He said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to actually say that there is a bisection between those things. And he does this marvelous job of work of actually painstakingly taking it through. Now, but maybe just for the purpose of people who are not familiar, can you give us a sense of what is the dual hemisphere hypothesis of the brain, and why is he a leading researcher in this area?
Yeah, again, I will, but it's like the take-home message for those who who cannot, I understand, afford to spend the money, the time, or the energy to read more than 1,000 pages. But well, Iain has done, I think, two remarkable things here, I believe. One is, it is hard to entertain or study something taboo.
Yeah.
It is harder, perhaps, to do so with a myth that has been debunked. And that's one of the merits of Iain. What's that myth that has been debunked? What was that pop psychological notion? Well, we have a right side of the brain and a left side of the brain, and the myth is, well, one is an artist and the other one is a mathematician, logician, right? One dances and imagines and writes poetry. The other one just is sharp like a knife and does Excel sheets and can write pieces of code and can talk very, very, very rationally, right? It's that myth of separation of function, and each one allocated to the left side or the right side. So Iain took that myth and say, well, that's wrong, but there's a truth in it. So it is wrong that each hemisphere does a different thing, but it is true that they do the same things differently. And it is this different way of attending to the world, perceiving the world, acting upon the world, and so on, that's crucial, not just for us individuals. And he spends many chapters to document his hypothesis with neurological data of patients who have had strokes in different hemispheres. And perhaps is the most comprehensive gathering of references from the literature, right? Not only does Iain do that, but he also then goes further and says, well, beyond neurology, beyond neuroscience, what can we say about epistemology, how we know things? And then he even goes further. What can we say? What the sciences say? What have the great physicists said? And also metaphysically, what does that entail for our understanding of matter, time, space, consciousness, and even the sacred, right? So it's literally, and these phrases is overused, it's worn out, but it's literally a tour de force to just triangulate from many perspectives and disciplines. And triangulation means, look, this arrow is pointing this way, and this is a really hard arrow made of a lot of thinking, a lot of reading, a lot of literature. But there's this other arrow coming from metaphysics, it's pointing here, and there's this other arrow coming from physics. And so, well, if they're all pointing there must be some truth in it. Plus, the urgency of the matter with things with the book is that, as he writes there, and he uses some stories, some myths to illustrate it, it has happened 2 times, he argues, in the history of humanity that we know, and maybe we won't make it if it happens a 3rd time. This reversal of control, where the emissary takes control of what the master should be in charge of. And so it's a warning for us humans today. And yes, and so that's only one of the highlights I wanted to make, how he has rehabilitated a debunked notion into something that's so valuable today. The second one that I can say, after having spent so many hours with Iain, is that there's this irony, this sweet irony, this paradox, because he obviously has a huge heart. I can attest to that. He has a tremendous intellect. You can attest to that. Now, with his intellect, he's written a book that has revealed the very limits of the intellect. So this is extraordinary. This is like, these theorems in mathematics or in physics, like Gödel's theorem. In a way, this just occurred to me. He's done the same thing through writing. He's shown how far the intellect can go and how difficult it is to realize its own limitations. So that's the irony, because many times I'm discussing with him and it's like, wow, you're telling us all the great things the Emissary can do, and you've written thousands of pages using the power of the left brain, if you want. Nevertheless, you haven't lost track. The right hemisphere is still there. And so the danger is that this falls into scientism. But it's like, if you're so strong intellectually, it's easy to be corrupted by the ring. You see, the Lord of the Rings. Like, if you have that power, it's so easy after thousands of pages to say, look what I can do with my intellect, But what does Iain do? Say, yes, and this is as far as I can go. These are my limitations. When using that tool, which is our intellect. And there are other ways, other tools that need to co-inhabit that continent, right? Which has imagination, intuition, and even a sense of the sacred. And so that's incredible. It's like an eye that not only can see at the distance with great detail, but also kind of sees its own blind spot. That's truly remarkable.
It is. In fact, I have a hypothesis of my own as to why you and Iain did that, or shall we say, why you needed to do that, whether there was how much strategic decision in it, that you can tell me, and it would be interesting what Iain says. And my hypothesis is that given that the left brain's speciality is to apprehend reality by means of language, description, and collecting data as the emissary, and secondly, given that the message of the book was to, in a sense, try and get the emissary subordinate again to the master, the right hemisphere, which comprehends that which the left hemisphere cannot because of its preoccupation with specificity. It sees context, it sees paradox, intuition, value, and meaning. You and Iain wanted to practice what that Iain was preaching. You wanted to lovingly convey the truth of the book in a relational manner, in a conversational manner. And since the right brain comprehends reality by connecting, with the left brain has collected. So you enabled, in a sense, a larger emergent truth to come out, which wasn't just simply the accumulation of more knowledge to thump those scientists over the head who think that this is false or true or what. There was a generation of a new emergence of consciousness. And I can say, for me as a social worker for 40 years, I now feel I can actually, paradoxically, some compassion for those who only use half their brains, the left brain, and they make big decisions with hugely devastating consequences for so many people, including ultimately themselves. I really came away from listening to that thing, religiously with my friend Rod Charlton, reflecting on it, saying, truth has emerged, and to make this last very important point, which another great thinker helped me understand, René Girard. When we look at the issue of truth and love as being two deep kind of core values that give us a sense of our humanity, truth cannot engender love, but love can engender truth. So there is, in a sense, a directional relationship. And you cannot understand that which you do not love. And I just love the way Iain kept making the point that when we use the term truth, it is only really understandable in relational terms. Were you conscious of doing that? Because that's the effect you've had.
I wasn't. So you're making me conscious now. Thank you. Well, it's a beautiful image. And well, as we were talking on Zoom and we had both screens, I could see him, I could see me. There was something also performative or visual about left and right I don't know who was what, but yes, it was an emergent encounter, right? And you would say why there may be more rational arguments as why we did that, right? Well, some people won't be able to read the book, so maybe they can listen to us as they're cooking or driving, so this can pave the way for some people. That's good enough. Another reason, which I think is more honest, is we do it because we feel we want to do it. Like, because I particularly for me, it was like, okay, I have this personal tutor for more than 30 hours, right? What a way to read him and then talk to him and so on. So really, the main reason I did it for myself. But if on top of it, this turned out that to be an embodiment, an experiment of what the very thing that the book tries to convey, well, that's great to hear that it was through that relationship, and it resonates because there's another, well, there's so many themes in the book, but one other thing I learned from Iain is that truth and trust are not so far away. That comes across in some of the chapters, and well, it's amazing because it has to do with communities, and it has to do with the way we relate to each other and how we speak truth to each other. And also it has to do with the scientific methods, as you were making these points, as to what it means to understand and how that is related to love. I can only think of one of the big habits we've inherited as scientists after more than 400 years, which is what Francis Bacon so ruthlessly wrote, which is, well, this is how we're gonna relate to nature. That's how we're gonna relate to her. We're gonna interrogate her. You know, we're gonna force, we're gonna torture, and the torture, I've looked for it. He never used the word torture, but I've quoted him, and that's what he's saying. He says, we'll pursue her to all her corners, and we'll just we'll make it spit its secrets, right? Well, that's one mode of relation. Now, see what kind of relationship you would have if you would do this with your friends, with your partner, with your daughters, right? Well, that's one mode. It's proved successful for some matters, but there are other ways of relating, right, that are more loving. And if they're more loving, perhaps they allow for trust to be built, and then they would allow for a different kind of truth to emerge. So scientists are in constant dialogue with nature, and like journalists or like any relationship, the way you ask the question, in the same manner, you'll see it come back like an echo, right? So if you address somebody with some angry tone, most likely you're going to get an angry reply back. If you whisper to somebody in the ear, you're going to create another kind of response. So what do we want to get out of our encounter with the world, be it with nature in the lab or be with our fellow humans or other animals? Well, different types of relationships. And one more thing to add, because it made me think of the Wizard of Oz. You know, the Wizard of Oz, as the ultimate therapist. I'm not a therapist. One of my best friends, perhaps my best friend, is a therapist who's been doing it for more than 40 years, and we speak often about that. And what does he do? He says he's the Wizard of Oz. So people come, and what are you? You're gonna give them advice? No. You're gonna tell them what to do? No. But you're gonna tell them nothing? No. So maybe you want to be a mirror, but a mirror that uses the right mask at the right moment for the other person to realize. And that's a confession. Maybe I do that too when I speak to so many different people, and often I play the role of the buffoon. What's the name in English? You know, the person that appears in front. I've recognized this in me. This is one of my many masks, and it's a very interesting one because it allows me so far to speak truth to power. I can appear in front of the king and say, look at this, look at that, and survive the encounter without my head being cut so far. and be able to say things, and so that they can be heard. And actually, when I address young scientists now, I refrain from telling them my own research, which is kind of the hard skills. Give me the data, and now they invite me to tell them more about the soft skills. And the feedback is beautiful. The feedback is, hey, Alex, we all think that what you said. We all think about that. We never hear it. Thanks for saying it, right? So there's something very powerful about uttering certain truths and how we do it.
I want to just quickly, before I forget it, that wonderful insight you talked about how between you and Iain, you became conscious of your blind spots. And in the process of that relationship, and that is so helpful to me, because in my own role as a counselor, a therapist, and conflict resolution particularly, I said, and one of my mentors, in fact, the wife of Stafford Beer, she said, we all have our blind spots, but they don't show up as dark patches. We're not conscious of them. However, manipulative, potentially sociopathic people who are clever can work out your blind spots and use it to manipulate you and to actually control you. Because, and that's why Brené Brown is a great inspiration. He says, you've got to own your story. You've got to find that sense in which you find your self-care, your self-love, your self-forgiveness, because then you get the right to finish the story. But if you don't, somebody else will. Somebody else will take advantage of you. And why I asked you to start off by introducing you in terms of what you've inherited from your grandparents. And you said, that's a bit of a surprise. Well, I had that experience 30 or so years ago where somebody's running a workshop. She said, yeah, you're all strangers, introduce yourselves to each other. And she said, but tell your partner what characteristics you've inherited from one or more of your grandparents. Now, because it's not a question any of us have thought about, immediately it became a self-disclosure and a self-discovery as we were explaining to the other person. And it was quite funny because I was telling you in our email correspondence that I did know my grandmother. And I suddenly for the first time realized what a wonderful influence she had been in my life. And when I was still in primary school years, stayed often with her. And she maintained this wonderful fiction that she was Spanish and that she was from Spanish aristocracy. And of course, as a child, you live in that sort of fantastical world. That's why, in a sense, it's made me particularly warm towards people who are Spanish, like you, and be intrigued by the sort of as you talk about this myth, what truth is there in it? Now, my grandmother wasn't born in Spain. She wasn't from Spanish. She was born in Leipertsvlei in the Transvaal, in a few years after gold was discovered in South Africa, and lived a very hard life, a tragic life. And that's why I was interested to say your grandparents were in the mining industry. I relate that back to saying the question of our blind spots not showing up as dark patches. As they start filling out, as love enables us to fill in the gaps. And that's partly why I just, in my group work and working with people, saying if we're going to, defend ourselves against this toxic power, how can we help each other become more conscious of our blind spots? Because we can be sure that that's what they're going to try and find our weakness, and that's how they're going to sow dissension and division in us, and that's how power prevails. It divides and then it rules.
Also have a tendency to locate the dark side outside and the bright side inside, even with left and right distinctions, left brain and right brain distinction. Sometimes we speak, and you were doing it like this minutes ago, and so do I. We seem to be saying, oh, those toxic elements out there, those kind of left brain out there, whereas here it's my right brain and pristine, and how to avoid being contaminated. And after COVID, it's like this idea that the pathogen is out there, and it's going to infect me. And these war metaphors, we need to defeat it. The war against, the Americans love it. The war against cancer, the war against everything, right? Drugs, the war against COVID.
Crime, war against corruption.
I'm sorry, probably not. Probably that's a wrong starting point that we've inherited. Because, and I'm speculating here, right? But what if disease, what if illness, it's not, what if a cancer, it's not these motherfucker cells that want to, make my life miserable? What is if it's me telling me something? And again, what a different approach. And I understand one sometimes need to just kill them all. But what does that tell me about myself, right? What about the virus? Yes, we can sequence it and we'll use all these, we'll force upon people all these measures, right? Because experts say, well, what does it mean? What does it mean to be infected? And why do people get infected and suffer from it and others don't, right? So I'm just trying to say the boundaries between good and evil, this is very much like the Hollywood movie that helps us very clearly. And it's very archetypical, right? And I understand it. It helps us. So in a movie, you can always ask, well, who's the good guy and who's the bad guy? This one and this one. Okay, the clash is clear. Well, it's not so clear. Like, look at even Star Wars. I mean, is the bad guy has a good guy inside, and the good guy has a bad guy inside. So it's maybe like a yin yang also image, like there's and it's been said, like the light that divides evil from, what's the quote, right? It crosses the heart of every human being.
Yeah.
So let's be careful with it, because I'm speaking to myself right here, because in coming out of the closet, as I say, from scientific orthodoxy, navigate the heterodox waters and now the heretical waters, and the people looking for the new paradigm. Well, I don't want to go from A to B and be in the same place, in the sense of, well, we got it right, they got it wrong, we will win because we're the good guys. Like, oh no, this is a waste of time. I don't think that's how we're gonna make it, to just change team. Like, you used to be from Football Club Barcelona in Spain. Okay, now you're gonna be from Real Madrid, and now we're gonna be the best. There's something there that it's not deep enough.
No, I get that. And I mean, that quote from Solzhenitsyn in my own work, and I reflect about it a bit in my book, and what I'm now going away to start trying to grapple with my own narrative and story, and what does it really have to say. I came across it early when I was getting involved with this deep conflict over mining in one of our most beautiful, pristine areas of South Africa on the wild coast. And I was inspired and encouraged by another friend and mentor, Alistair McIntosh, who is a Quaker pacifist who successfully, it sounds like we're saying he did it. He had the insight from someone else that the way forward was just firstly to name the powers, to unmask the powers, and then to engage them.
Because what naming allows is to, in a way, it's a kind of sorcery. It creates realities. And I don't mean whatever you imagine is true. No, it's not that kind of thing. But the moment you can name something, the elephant in the room, as English people like to say, well, if it's named, that's why I was talking about being in front of the king and saying certain things. Now, it came to mind that the story of Dr. Frankenstein has so many values. That's why it's a classic, right? Mary Shelley's. Pay attention, that monster, first of all, it doesn't have a mother. Talking about ancestors, it doesn't have a mother. I mean, we could go on and on. Then it's not born, it's made. Then the father who's mothering it just runs away the moment he sees what he had done. Maybe that even ties back to artificial intelligence, right? Oh shit, what is that? And he runs away. So the creature, the monster, doesn't have a mother. The father goes away. If you recall in the story, it learns, and I'm saying it deliberately, it learns to speak like humans because it's looking through a cabin, in a cottage cabin, and looking at other people speaking. And there's a blind man, but then they discover the monster is around. So it is expelled from society, and it doesn't have a name. can you imagine having a kid, not calling the kid anything? Like, what is your name, right? So all of that tells us about these Frankensteinian entities around. So naming them, it's a start, because you name it, you give it a place, and then maybe not only can you kill the monster, maybe you can just reintegrate the monster into society, which is what the poor monster needed. It needed to have a mother, to have a society, and to be part of. It needed to belong. It needed to belong, not to be. And so the more you push it away, and it finally goes away and commits suicide. I mean, it's a heartbreaking story that it could have been written 1 month ago, just 200 years old.
That's partly why apartheid was so terrible that it actually created this second-class citizen and basically unraveled, and particularly the mining industry in this country, which then had fathers were away from home having to work in the mines, and children growing up. And we've got this terrible pandemic of gender-based violence, of corruption, and all the rest. And part of me is saying, well, we don't just need to go to court and find a judge in the Supreme Court of Appeal, find a judgment in favor of us. Well, we've already done that. We've got judgments in favor of us. It's not going to deal with the deeper pathology that's in society. What about in naming the powers that motivate me, unmask them, and engage them? And how do I come to terms with it? Which is why I found the idea of left-right brain thing so helpful, because I could now say, oh, if I'm going to unmask and I've got to allow my right brain to help me think this thing through and contextualize it and to embrace the mystery. I'm not going to be able to simply say, okay, follow this particular prescription and your problem will be solved. Having done that, I found that in this fight with this foreign mining company from Australia, who basically wanted to mine the Wild Coast for titanium. And it's, for people who want to know a shorthand of it, if they've seen the film Avatar, it's uncanny at how much that same story is modeled by what I went through. So Hollywood was there coming to our rescue too, to help us raise a consciousness. But in engaging the powers, engaging the mining company, they became most helpful to me in actually understanding. It eventually ended up with me and 5 other people getting sued in a defamation slap suit. But because I'd engaged the powers already and I knew people in the mining company, I was able to really understand what was really going on and somehow transcend this binary. Journalists would call me and say, oh, you know, John, you're anti-mining activist. No, I'd say. Platinum is very close to my heart. I have 2 stents in my heart which keep me alive. I would be a hypocrite if I were an anti-mining activist. I said, but what I do need to say, it breaks my heart to see how the injustices that go into the whole mining industry and the suffering that it's caused in people to give me my privilege of being able to survive. We're now looking towards the end of that whole slap suit. We have actually got success in the Constitutional Court. They have outlawed that sort of very vindictive type thing and the weaponizing of the law. And he said, well, I want you to apologize. I said, no, Mark, I'm not going to apologize. I'm going to thank you because you actually have helped me understand, which of course it's not an easy message to get across because it's so much more comfortable to sit in binary sort of dualisms and actually kind of externalize the enemy out there and just simply say, well, once they're overcome and vanquished, well, then we'll all be okay and we'll, you know, expel them, scapegoat them, send them to Australia. So I want to just give you a little bit of that narrative of my own, just to finish. Getting back to the matter with things. And I'm saying this simply in acknowledgement that I'm finding in the matter with things something which has given me a language. You talk about naming, some sort of conceptual ability to start finding a way of mediating a new conversation in our society about power. We're speaking truth to power. What is the truth about power? How does it affect the neural pathways of the brain and create the dopamine effect, which then tends to lead towards intoxication with power. Or the work of Lord David Owen, who was a neurologist and a politician who's talked about hubris and the hubris syndrome and the pattern of behavior that seems to be very similar to a left brain dominance. Say a bit about that, if you've got any enlightenment for me about how to take research interest further.
Well, let me go on a tangent here and in a way deflect the invitation to argue around these neurally and make the point that, sure, we can look for neural explanations of all these that we're talking about, even, even the sacred, if you want, or power, and go through a different route, a different kind of story. Because after all, this is about stories we tell, and I mean it in a deep sense. And so back to the masks. I'd like to bring here Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, who's a hero of mine. And his last book is called The Two Sources of Morality and Religion. Mm-hmm. It's not very well known. It's delicious, as all of his books. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1927, I think. And he was as famous as Albert Einstein until they had that clash 100 years ago. The story is fascinating. Anyways, you were talking about activism a few moments ago, which has to do with a fight against, or you could even say for power, right? But when activism comes from resentment, it becomes Frankensteinian again, right? So rather than activism through moaning, grievance, and cancel culture, what about activism through love, right? How does that look like? And we have the Dalai Lama say, well, my enemy friend. Didn't he say that when he was talking about the Chinese? My enemy friend. And so,
frenemy.
Yeah, frenemy. Yeah, my frenemy. so back to Hollywood. Well, there's more truth in beneath the good guy versus bad guy, because the notion of arch nemesis, it's like you need the enemy for you to play the role of the hero. So in a way you're against it, but you need it. So you see that weird dynamics between I'm a victim, but I need the villain for me to be called still a victim. Well, what would happen if let's imagine the villain can vanish right now? What am I now if I'm not a victim, right? So what other mask can I wear? Now, the hero is a pretty cool one. What about the saint or the mystic, right? And that's what Bergson talks about in The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, and open societies and closed societies, the difference he makes. It's worth contemplating because these roles have been so caricaturized, right? But perhaps we need more Mother Teresa's, more saints along those ways than people throwing paint on paintings, you see? Which comes back to the young ones, and they're angry for the right reasons, but are they acting out the right reasons too, or they're just contributing to the fire with more wood? It's complicated. I'm not judging it. I'm just saying I see it in me, right? Like this complaining mode, this cynicism, being a cynic. I mean, I use sarcasm. Maybe it's a bit healthier than cynicism, but it has to do with the lifting of spirit. How can we lift our spirit so that we don't enter into these confrontation modes with the blind spot that is that in doing that we're just contributing to more of the same.
One of the things I've observed about you as I've watched you doing your conversations with your Future Human series, and that is your ability to, in a sort of lovingly way, sort of just take what potentially kind of controversies and to work with them as and people both sides finding, oh yeah, this is great. How do you deal with resentment? Let me just frame it for you like this. My daughter's just left to go back to the Netherlands after a month. And I don't think she'll mind me telling you this, because she says, Dad, I've come back after 18 months. I'm horrified how traumatized your South Africans are, and how they are just abused, are suffering trauma, and are really kind of are turning against each other in ways which it really makes no sense, because it's actually undermining the whole cohesion of society, because people are just so deeply resentful, because they've got every good reason to be resentful and angry, because there has been shocking abuse of power in this country. The capture of and dismantling of our state, undoing all the gains of what we achieved with Nelson Mandela after apartheid, when you were a little boy growing up and seeing what this new South Africa, it's in shatters. It really is quite distressing. I'm committed to staying here because I meet people all the time, like whistleblowers and others, and really wonderful journalists, and really some very good scientists and academics too, who say there's a phenomenon to be learned from here. What my contribution is to them is to say, how can I help you overcome your resentment and whatever traumas? Have you had experiences that you can relate to in that respect?
Yes, and you see here is the imposter syndrome coming again. Like, okay, now as a theoretical physicist turned neuroscientist, I'm invited to comment on South African resentment. So what am I going to say? Well, what comes to mind again is naming, right? And I'm thinking of my daughters in particular, right? But I'll talk about myself too. But when they're angry about something, yes, probably it's not a good idea to suppress, to say, well, we have this, and probably it's also in English, in Spanish, when something happens, we say, no pasa nada, no pasa nada. It's fine, it's fine. Well, no, it's not fine. They just bumped into a table, or something happened to them and they're crying. So first you must acknowledge, you must name that thing, like Frankenstein, right? This is happening. Yes. Now, so it has a place. Yes. But it has a place. Does it have all the space in that place? You see what I mean? Like, is this going to be the center? Is this going to be the sun of the solar system? Is everything going to orbit around that feeling, that just feeling of resentment? Well, probably the constellation is not right. And so something that helps me particularly is the difference between why we do things and what for. So the why is what has pushed us from the past so that we're doing what we're doing now. And there's so many whys, and they're honorable. They all make sense. Because when I was young, this happened to me. Because you see in my family this or that. Because I met that person and, he or she betrayed me, and then I did so. These are all the whys. There's this big bundle of whys. Again, I'm not a therapist, but I feel a lot of therapy work is kind of try to just unknot all these whys. But if we forget the other side, which is not the why, but the what for, it's not what pushes us, but what's pulling us, right? Yes, I'm doing this because. It's like because has a bifurcates. It's like I'm doing this because blah, 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 blah. Sure, your story, your personal narrative, fine, has a place, but it's not going to be the center of the galaxy. It's like there's a what for. What is pulling you? Where do you go if you continue with this grief, right? Or with this grievance, better said. So that's what comes to mind. A difference between push and pull. And also we've talked about ancestors and remembering. But there's also forgiveness, which sounds old-fashioned, right? Forgiving. We spoke about love a minute ago, like the frenemy, the enemy friend. Well, love your enemy. Oh, cliche. Well, love your enemy is the kind of activism we were talking about. Well, what about forgive your enemy? Of course, that's not something that's prescribed or it's like what you cannot force someone to be free. You cannot force someone to forgive somebody. But Anna Arendt wrote about those alchemical powers of the human species, right? We can hope for the future, and we can forgive what happened in the past. It is hard. What can I say?
And it's in the hardness that we experience the personal emancipation. To wrap things up, I mean, the response I use with people in resentment, and it doesn't come from me, it comes from Henri Nouwen, who he said, the antidote to corrosive, debilitating resentment is gratitude. So I want to ask you, What are you grateful for?
Yes. So disclaimer is I'm a lucky man. I'm a lucky person, and I can see why other people, or how other people are not so lucky. I don't want to say privileged, because this brings us into this spiral. So that's one thing, but I also make efforts. So there are two words that I like to have together, which are grace and will. I learned those when I went to India. That's a long story, but there's something about our will that's necessary, human will. It's like upwards movement, but without the downwards, the reception of the downwards movement, will, it's so petty, So it's, but without will, in a way, you cannot. Well, maybe you can receive the grace. So it's both. So gratitude is little, the being grateful little by little is the reminder of this grace with capital G. So, for instance, an exercise I do with my daughters every night when we put them to bed, I ask them, okay, what are you grateful for today? It's so interesting, because at the beginning it's like, I don't want to say anything about that. And just continue reading whatever I'm reading. But then they start saying what they're grateful. It's so interesting to watch the little things they can say they're grateful for. Like, because of what you brought me to have as a snack today, something very minor. Sometimes it's things that are quite beautiful. Like sometimes they say I'm grateful for the family we have, but it's not that I planted those ideas explicitly. Anyways, the exercise of every day saying what you're grateful for. And some days I forget to say, because I'm tired, okay, what are you grateful for? And then they remind me, hey, Dad, we need to say what we're grateful for. Like, is this praying? Well, yes and no, right? So this little exercise of little graces build up and I think help to recognize that despite all the suffering, which is true, there's this constant download of graces, and it's also there's something about a choice. If they're offerings, if they're not kind of forced miracles upon us, that would be an oxymoron, right? Like, okay, I compel you to. If they're offerings, we can take them or we can refuse them, and so there's an important job in getting ready to receive those presents. Like, today's my birthday, I'll receive presents. Could you imagine, like, when I get the present, say, you know what, I don't deserve this, thank you. Well, I feel we're doing this a lot with our lives. I don't deserve this present. Let me tell you the reasons. Because I don't know, because it's too expensive, because I didn't buy you a present when it was your birthday, because today I'm feeling this, I'm feeling that, I'm feeling. Why don't we take the presence of life? It's a mystery, right? So back to the other side of grievance. Yes, this happened to me, and I'm so much of a victim. But if you're so much of a victim, why aren't we taking the presents when they come in the present moment? And that has also to do, just to add one more thought, with the culture of deserving things, merit. I'm not saying we don't need that, but this is another thing I've come across again with my daughters, which is what really grounds me to life, right? When let's say now you're on the other end, you want to gift them something, right? So often we try to articulate the exchange as if they need to deserve it. But what if we just practice the habit of, well, no, precisely, I'm offering this to you, or I'm gifting it to you, regardless of whether you deserve it or not. This is a realization I've had. It's so hard to accept something that you think you don't deserve. That's the beginning of gratitude, and then when you make this G grow, then grace comes upon.
I'm just tempted to ask you one last question. Seeing you talking about your daughters, what did the effect of when you learned that you were going to become a father, what impact did that have on you? Because on me, I had all the theory, I had all the training, and suddenly I was going to be a father. And it's just no longer about abstract, ideological, theoretical stuff. There was a baby that was going to be born. I was going, from my genes, from my wife's genes, what sort of world was this child coming in through? And then when my daughter came along, even more underscored. And I mean, she at one point, she said, Dad, stop all this nonsense going on the Wild Coast. Come home. We're missing you. And I remember saying to her, darling, this isn't about just them and solving their problems. This is about your future too. And that was when she was in her middle high school. And in her final year of high school, she was assigned an essay to write. And because this had been in the media about this mining, and the essay, it was in biology. She was asked in the exam question, what do you think? Is it a good or bad idea to mine the Wild Coast for titanium? You have 4 sources from the newspapers to quote from, write an essay and make your case. And she says, guess what, Dad? One of them was you. So, and then that's just how she understood. And of course, the bonding of that was like very vindicating for me, because in a sense, I just realized I wasn't just there to be an activist to stop the mining. I was there to say, given the fact that I have, platinum close to my heart, I've been given this extra days to kind of, thanks to the mining industry, how can I use it in such a way that future miners would appreciate it, because we've now basically got a more holistic view of what mining and that means, instead of this extractive, exploitative, damaging, and all that stuff. Anyway, I'm just inserting that because tell us a bit about your own experience of coming to the awareness of being a father.
Yes. Well, that's fascinating you ask this. First of all, as a theoretical physicist, we're sold the idea that with whiteboards and pens and your mind, you can figure things out, and you can. But being a father is perhaps one of the most radical experiences in realizing how it's like all these layers, and they have different time scales. If I can use a physicist language, let me explain. Yes, first you're going to be a father, because your partner tells you, okay, you can start thinking about it. Then you start to see it because the belly grows and the house starts changing as you're preparing for it. And you think you more or less get it under control, because you may read books about, and you've been a son, right? And you've seen other parents. So that way you've seen parenting around, you've read about it, it's coming for you, you see it change. Well, what about the emotions, right? And what about the inner, there's something that's not yet ready, but you think you think theoretically. Now, that's my experience. I think it's pretty universal. Now, when the baby is born, you have no idea that a weapon of mass destruction has been dropped in your house. It's, oh, how cute, wow, it's like getting married, it's like, this is the most amazing moment in my life, and it could be. You have a weapon of mass destruction. You don't know, right? Because this is gonna reconfigure. I mean, I speak from experience. It's gonna reconfigure your relationship to your partner. In many cases, it's going to break it. It's going to destroy your old way of relating to your partner. By the way, I attended. I was part of a group like AA, but for parents. I used to go every Saturday morning, and we would go in circle and just, no solutions, no bullet points, no action lines, but just share what the fuck is happening, right? So it's a weapon of mass. Your relationship changed, your economy changes. It's a weapon of mass destruction to your economy. You never think you need to pay for so many things, even if you have an Excel sheet. It's a weapon of mass destruction for your normal routine. You're gonna sleep less and worse. You're gonna be more preoccupied. You won't be able to go to concerts, to do sports as you used to read in the piece you used to. It just changes so many things, right? And yet, despite that curse, it is a bigger blessing. So it's incredible what just from that perspective, and so you see how some people are biological fathers and actually legally fathers, meaning that they're there, but I think they still haven't realized they are a father. There's like, I can imagine like an impact, and then this moves, but there's a part in here that still hasn't figured it out. And okay, now it's two white men talking about parenthood, but it's not talked about. Like, I can see it all around, even in me. It's like, yes, you're a father, you're 40 something, but we have all these habits as if we were teenagers. We still want to do this and that. So it's amazing. And if you haven't had this experience, what I'm saying will sound just theoretical, like experiencing somebody dying, right? You know what death is. You know, everybody dies. You see people around dying. Well, only in movies, by the way. We don't see the dying people anymore. Well, it's only until you're dying or somebody really close to you are dying that you experience this existential shock wave, right? So being a father is one of them, and we're not told. Maybe because we only need to experience it in order for us to know. It is incredible, and what these things do. And it's like sex or like death or being a parent. We don't talk about it as often as I think we need. Not even we should. We need.
Well,
when do you talk about this with people? We don't talk about it. It's taboo. It's taboo. Sorry.
I just hope this conversation will, because in South Africa, as I mentioned, you've got this epidemic of gender-based violence because we don't talk about these things, and because of the whole thing of, and as a social worker, as a male social worker, I'm really concerned because there's very few, relatively speaking, very few men go into social work. And I'm on a recruitment drive, so I'm wanting to say maybe your next kind of big challenge, Alex, is that you are to become a social worker, because well, that you are in a sense, because and I just want to affirm you this, because the key issue in helping a person in crisis is to get some sense of their capacity for insight, their capacity to learn from experience. And in a sense, what I have got from you is this ability to have deeper insight and not fixing things. Your Wizard of Oz story is very interesting. The real imposter is actually the Wizard of Oz. The whole story of Dorothy's journey in the yellow brick road. It was the integration, meeting the three friends that were projections of herself. The Tin Man who had no heart, the Straw Man who had no brain, the Lion which had no courage. So her journey towards individuation, let's use that term, it was more important than the destination, because it was enabling her to have that holistic integration of tough mind, tender heart, steady hands, which has got me so excited. And I just hope that this gets some contribution to helping our collective survival advantage, that the human species also does belong to the earth. We are not just aliens, that we do have roots and a future.
Yes.
Last words from you.
No, not last. Second to last.
Okay.
Yeah, no, anyways, I don't want to conclude anything. Maybe as homework for all of us, because you mentioned the word individuation. If we could just grasp the difference between individuality, the cult for individuality, and the subtlety of what individuation is, we'll be much better off in our personal businesses, and also when we talk about the planet and the future human. So thank you for mentioning that. It's yes, it's a secret word. It's waiting there for us. It's like a stone, like a magic stone, to just take lift and look what's underneath, because much of what we're talking about, what we have been talking about today, is our paths of individuation as human beings, and our unfinished.
Well, while working on the editing and post-production, another of my favorite quotes from famous people came to mind. Søren Kierkegaard, the 19th century Danish philosopher and theologian, who said, "Life can only be understood backwards but it must be lived forwards. Now, Ian and his emissary, Alex, have given us much to help us understand our lives better backwards. And I thought it would be useful to have some reflections of my own that came to mind as I've been working through this material, putting it together. However, rather than prolong this video, I put them into a second upload, a part 2, Reflections. So the link should be appearing above now, but if it doesn't, I will put it in the description below. And I'd be really grateful for any comments so we can keep the dialogue going and see how we can support each other in continuing to live our lives forwards with greater confidence. But before you go there, if you're wondering where I am and what all these shelves of books are that I've been having in my background, I'm again at the Molly Blackburn Library at 3 Tree Hill Luxury Guest House at Speenkorp in the KwaZulu-Natal Midlands. I'm here as a guest of Simon and Cheryl Blackburn and their family and the wonderful staff who have been looking after guests with their exceptional hospitality. I say I'm here again because last year I made a film that showcases the attractions of the Molly Blackburn Library and 3 Tree Hill Lodge. And the link is now appearing above if you want to just watch that and you'll get the full picture. I'm actually here for a few weeks writing my next book, and in between supervising her children doing their homework, Cheryl keeps prodding me along in that endeavor and made the mistake of saying to me, "We're not going to let you go until you finished it," which, given this amazing place, is hardly an incentive to get the job done. So I can take my time as long as I can. And I'm sure, like Ian did in writing his book, Matter with Things, he took 10 years. I think I can stretch out writing my book for another 10 years. Anyway, Cheryl's now changed the incentive and she's now saying she'll kick me out if I don't get working on it, which I shall now do just as soon as I get this uploaded. I've been mingling with guests while taking breaks and making new friends. One of them, Jim Anderson, was a retired medical doctor now living in Perth in Australia. And he was fascinated when I told him about the Matter with Things. And Jim specialized in radiology, so he understands it all. And most of his life has been spent looking at images and scans of brains. So he can't wait to read the book himself. And Jim was here with his wife, who's a speech therapist, and his sister, Joan Deere, who I was delighted to discover was also a social worker. So you can imagine the extraordinary conversations we had around the dinner table. Well, they left yesterday with Joan declaring her resolve to tell everyone about 3 Tree Hill Lodge as one of South Africa's best kept secrets. So Joan, this is made for you to help you in that task, because Simon and Cheryl obviously don't want this exceptional place to be kept a secret anymore. So this is a big shout out for them. And since making this film last year to pay tribute to Molly Blackburn, Simon's mother, she's since been honoured with the 2023 Presidential Award of the Order of Luthuli, which, quote, recognises South African citizens who have contributed to the struggle for democracy, nation building, building democracy and human rights, justice and peace, as well as for the resolution of conflict.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Order of Luthuli in silver is hereby bestowed on Ms. Molly Bellhouse Blackburn, posthumously, here today represented by Ms. Fen van Donner, for her contribution to the fight for liberation in South Africa, often risking her life for family upholding the liberation cause and ideals to the end.
So if any of you are watching from outside South Africa and you want a vacation, you will not be disappointed coming here. And since the film was made, the South African currency is also kind of plummeted against the US dollar, the pound and the euro. So it's a fairly affordable trip now. And who knows, you might find me here and I can regale you with stories, to borrow another witticism from my late mentor Stafford Beer, as I further recline into my anecdotage. Lastly, another development since my last visit is that Simon has just bought himself a drone cam. So what better way to end this wonderful conversation than to have his son Neo piloted up into the skies to give us a visual of this extraordinary place and what it has to offer.